Hello and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Charlie and I'm the Content Marketing Manager at Cision here in the UK. Today we're excited to bring you Operation Matterhorn, bringing 150,000 people home, a webinar presented by the Civil Aviation Authority to talk through how they managed the fallout from the collapse of major travel firm Thomas Cook. This follows their popular session at CommsCon in November, so if you missed CommsCon, now's your chance to catch up on this great session. A few housekeeping bits before we dive in. We're live tweeting using the hashtag Operation Matterhorn, so keep an eye on the Cision Twitter handle, and we do encourage you to get involved in the conversation throughout. On24 is the platform used to broadcast this webinar. You don't need to worry about muting your line or hearing background noise from other participants. And if you look around on the On24 suite, there are a couple of different features to utilize during the webinar. The most important one that I'd like to highlight is the Q&A widget on the left-hand side. If you have any questions throughout the webinar, feel free to ask them in the side panel and we will try to get back to you during the Q&A at the end. We may not be able to answer all the questions in the Q&A, so I do apologise if we don't read yours out. However, if we don't get to yours, our presenters have kindly agreed to answer some questions offline. So now on to the introductions. We're joined by two brilliant speakers from the Civil Aviation Authority, Richard Stephenson and Will Nathan. Richard joined the CAA in 2015 as Director of Communications, where he leads the multi-award-winning strategic communications function. He has held senior comms roles in high-profile businesses, including Centrica plc, AXA, and Royal Mail Group. Richard is currently the Honorary President of Kids Count and Chairman of the John Adams Society, the US State Department's alumni association in the UK. He was also recently appointed Communications Professional of the Year in 2019 at the CommsCon Awards. Our next speaker, Will, has led CAA's external relations and stakeholder engagement team since 2017 in January. He is responsible for CAA's relationship with Westminster, government officials and the industry, and also leads the CAA's common strategy regarding the UK's exit from the European Union. Prior to joining the CAA, he was at Weber Shandwick, the global communications agency, where he worked with international clients and focused on multi-market communications and engagement strategies. His clients included multinational organisations, high net worth individuals and foreign governments. Welcome both and thank you so much for being here. So that's enough from me. I know you're keen to hear what our speakers have to say, so without further ado, it's my pleasure to hand it over to Richard and Will.
Well, Charlie, thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you as well for the invitation to come and join you today. I know that Will and I thoroughly enjoyed CommsCon. It was a fantastic event, and we were very pleased to be there and to share in that event and to present our thoughts and our reflections from both dealing with the aftermath of the Monarch administration and also the Thomas Cook liquidation. So when you asked us to come back and do it all again through the power of a webinar, I think it was really an invitation that we couldn't say no to. So thank you very much for that. And thank you to everybody who is joining the webinar today. We're going to be talking to you about how we approached these two enormous operations, sharing our experience of how we went about planning, sharing our experience of how we went through the operation, but always remembering that both of these occasions were incredibly sad experiences, sad for the people who lost their jobs, sad for the people who were abroad, sad for the people who had future bookings with these companies. And you have to remember the scale of these operations. In the case of Thomas Cook, you're talking about 1 million people, approximately 1 million people who were directly impacted and touched by this liquidation. Now, the other thing we have to say is that we are still in the aftermath of this. We are still thinking an awful lot about it. This is still incredibly raw. It's not actually that long ago that Will and I and our teams and our colleagues found ourselves in the middle of Operation Matterhorn, which was the aftermath of the Thomas Cook liquidation. And we're still working on it. There are still a lot of things that we are doing, not least in the claims process for people who had future bookings with Thomas Cook, and we are now refunding a lot of that money to those people. But really, top of our mind is that we've been part of the team, and a very big team, a very dedicated team of people who have been responsible for the repatriation of 250,000 people over the last couple of years. And the last thing I'll say, just before we dive into the presentation, is that as we go through this and as we tell you about our experiences, as we share with you how we approach this, the one thing to remember is that we never, ever want to have to do this again for so many different reasons that we will talk about as we go through the presentation.
But the first question is, how did we find ourselves in this position in the first place? Well, firstly, we are the UK's aviation regulator, so we do everything from overseeing the safety of the aviation system in the UK to regulating how drones are used, right through to economically regulating some of our airports and our air navigation service providers, setting the airport charges that they can charge their airline customers. But we also license tour operators and airlines. And as part of this function, we oversee what's called the ATOL scheme for package holiday protection. So this means basically, if you go and buy a flight and alongside your flight you buy some accommodation or a car transfer, you will be buying a package holiday which requires ATOL protection. This means if your tour operator or your package holiday provider goes into administration, then we will bring you home. Now, the important thing to remember in the context of both Monarch and Thomas Cook is not all passengers had ATOL protection. In the instance of Monarch, it was about 15% of passengers, and in Thomas Cook, it was 60%. So our primary obligation in these scenarios are to those groups of passengers who have ATOL protection. However, this leaves government in a sticky situation in which you are potentially leaving 85% in Monarch's case of passengers stranded abroad, or the 40% in Thomas Cook's case. So what they have done is asked us to bring everyone home, regardless of whether they are ATOL protected or not. For us, that means we have to do everything in terms of the passenger repatriation, from sourcing the aircraft right through to running the 2-week flying program, deciding which airports aircraft are going to go to, which aircraft we're going to use on those routes, right through, and critically for this presentation, to communicating the operation, speaking to all the passengers affected, whether they have travelled or whether they are yet to travel.
So we thought it would be helpful to start by setting out the timeline, and actually a relatively short time frame for all of the things that we've had to manage over the last couple of years or so. So you can see there on the left-hand side of this, the planning process for what was Operation Olympia, which turned into the administration of Monarch, back in August of 2017. It seems like quite a long time ago now, but actually it's not very long ago at all. And that relatively short time frame for preparing for what was at the time the largest repatriation in peacetime that we'd ever seen. Unfortunately, at the beginning of October 2017, the Monarch repatriation program became a reality when the company went into administration, and we had to launch that enormous operation to bring all of those people home, which we'll talk about in a moment. After that program, we had to go into our learning the lessons process. And it's really, really important after any kind of significant event or significant operation, or just any kind of big operation that you can learn from, that you do an official learning the lessons process, because you never know what you're going to find out of it, you never know what you're going to discover, and you never know what your colleagues and others, both inside your organization and outside, are going to highlight for you. And it's incredibly valuable. Even if you never think you're going to have to do it again, it's incredibly valuable to learn those lessons and to reflect on them and to consider how you would operate things in the future. Now, unfortunately, it wasn't that long before we had to think about Thomas Cook, but we had been planning Operation Matterhorn. Now, Operation Matterhorn, when we first launched it, wasn't with any particular company in mind. It was how we would go about dealing with the failure of a major ATOL holder using the lessons we'd learned from the Monarch experience. And to make sure that, as a responsible regulator, we are ready, as best we can be, to deal with any eventuality that is presented to us. And then again, unfortunately, in September, the 23rd of September 2019, a date that I don't think Will or I will ever forget, Thomas Cook did go into liquidation, and we had to launch those plans and that operation and bring home a lot more people in a 2-week period. The future. We are now in the future. We are now thinking about all of those lessons that we learned. We are now dealing with the claims process, and we've already refunded about 330,000 people, but there is still some way to go on that. And we are still involved in a lessons learned process following the Thomas Cook operation. So to give you some context for what we're talking about, we wanted to give you the numbers as they stand. So back in 2017, confronted with the administration of Monarch, we had to launch what was at that time the biggest ever peacetime repatriation. There were 110,000 people abroad at the time in 10 countries around the world. Most of this was around the Mediterranean, but it did extend further than that. There were 80,000 future bookings, so 80,000 people, families, couples that had bookings in the future that we then had to manage in the aftermath of this. There were 3,000 employees in the UK. And as we'll come on to talk about, you always have to remember the employees, and you always have to look through that lens for every piece of communications, materials, assets that you produce for managing something like this. So you can see from these numbers, this was an incredibly daunting operation, with the government asking us to launch a repatriation operation to bring those 110,000 people back to the UK. Now, after this operation, we really didn't think that it could ever get any bigger than this. We didn't think that in our professional careers we would face another challenge that was even comparable, let alone bigger. However, then we were confronted with this.
So bigger it got. At the time that Thomas Cook went into liquidation, there were 150,000 passengers abroad. But critically, there was also 360,000 future bookings. So that's 40,000 more passengers abroad than during Monarch, but almost 300,000 more future bookings than during Monarch. And if you add that together, those future bookings represent about 800,000 different customers. So if you add that to the passengers abroad, we're talking about nearly 1 million people impacted across the UK and across the world by the liquidation of this company. There were also 9,000 employees in the UK, but also over 20,000 employees of Thomas Cook spread across the world, and 3,400 hoteliers were used by the Thomas Cook Group. Why this is so important is something we'll come back to a little bit later in the presentation, but presented some real communications challenges for us. And finally, they flew to 18 different countries. Now, while that sounds like only 8 more than that which happened during Monarch, they were also long-haul destinations, which was not an added complexity we were dealing with the Monarch repatriation. Thomas Cook flew everywhere from Las Vegas and Los Angeles right down to Cuba and across the Caribbean to Turkey and Egypt. That adds a huge challenge, not only from an operational perspective, where you're dealing with different time zones, but also a communications perspective, when you're dealing with passengers in difficult-to-reach places like Cuba, which don't have the same infrastructure that we have. And so we had to really think about how we would reach these hard-to-reach passengers throughout our communications efforts. As part of the Monarch repatriation, as Richard said, we did a really, really comprehensive lessons learned exercise. And for 3 key things that we thought we did best from a communications perspective in Monarch, we knew we wanted to replicate in any instance if we had to do this again. The core success of the communications campaign during Monarch was a single source of truth, our central source of truth. This was a dedicated microsite that we set up to be the source of information for all passengers and the whole industry of what they needed to do, what they needed to know to get home within 3 clicks. It was built to be enormously resilient and went live as soon as the company went into administration. We also recognized that if we were going to have to be doing something that we don't normally do as a regulator, which is communicate directly with passengers and customers, we were going to have to work out how we could make social media work for us and harness the power of being able to reach those passengers and those audiences in those difficult-to-reach places. And finally, the concept of putting yourself in other people's shoes is something that we did really well during Monarch and something that we wanted to replicate during the Thomas Cook experience. What would all our stakeholders need if they were waking up to this news very early on that Monday morning that their biggest airline customer or their biggest competitor or their biggest airline that might use their airport had gone into liquidation? What is all the material, all the collateral that they could possibly need? And we thought that through in advance.
So you have to take the best from these operations, and you have to learn from the best in these operations, and you have to really make sure that you create everything that you possibly can for the future from that best practice and from those best experiences and learnings. But you also have to learn the lessons for the things that don't go quite as well as you hope that they would. And learning those lessons, as I said earlier, is really important. You have to learn and you have to apply. Even if you think that you're never going to have to do something like this again, even if you think that you're not going to have to deal with something that's anywhere near as comparable with the operation you've just been through, you must still do that lessons learned process, because it will throw up all sorts of other opportunities to learn for other things that you will no doubt come into contact with and have to manage in the future. So be proud of what went well, be really proud of what went well, but also make sure that you are reflective and honest and transparent about what didn't quite go so well, so the next time it does. And there are three things I'm just going to pick up on in terms of our lessons learned from the Monarch experience. The first one is the risk of social. You need to know what you want from social, and you need to stick to the plan. It's very easy to get carried away when you see lots of creative opportunities to use social media, and that is something that can be both a blessing and a curse. It can deal with a particular operation, it can help you run an operation, but it can also sink your operation incredibly quickly if you do get distracted and you do move away from the plan. And the example that we have from Monarch is we were dealing with a lot of audiences, we were dealing with a lot of key stakeholders, we were communicating with lots of very, very different groups and audiences all the way through this. Our principal objective was to communicate with the passengers and with the customers of Monarch. But as we started to run our repatriation flights, we had our aircraft flying all over Europe, and we had our general aviation enthusiasts and the plane spotter community, still a very important audience for us, who started to identify these aircraft and started to talk about it on social media. And we responded in a way that we usually would with that particular audience by challenging them to find the next aircraft that were flying across Europe. Now, the problem was, for that audience, that was great. It was very much music to their ears and something that they wanted to engage with. Unfortunately, for some other audiences, such as customers and, of course, employees of Monarch, they thought that we were taking a very light-hearted approach to something that was far more serious. Now, this was never our intention. It wasn't something that we set out to do, and we stopped it immediately when we realized that we'd actually made a mistake, and we learned very clearly and very quickly from that mistake, and we communicated with those different audiences in different ways. But when you don't get it right, you have to pull back from it immediately, you have to apologize, and you have to get on. But it was something that we learned very, very quickly. The next one was colleague engagement. When you're in the middle of an operation like this and you have hundreds of people in your organization solely focused on running an airline for 2 weeks, which is something that we as an organization don't usually do, it's very easy to get focused and to remain focused on that operation and to let everything else that's going on across the organization sort of fade away somewhat from your thought process. Everybody in our organization played a critical role in both Monarch and in Thomas Cook. The mistake we made during the Monarch operation was we didn't recognize that through our internal communication and engagement as much as we should. So when it came to the Thomas Cook operation, we made very, very sure that through all of our internal engagements, we were highlighting the significance of the roles that everybody was playing, not just if you were on the operation doing a job that you don't usually do running an airline, but also those people that were backfilling the roles that had been vacated by those people running the operation, because that was still an incredibly important role. We have to make sure that we keep up with all of our regulatory obligations and not drop any balls anywhere. So people were covering, people were working twice as hard across the organization. It's really important that you recognize that and don't just get focused on one operation, which is really taking up the time of so many people. So everybody deserves equal credit regardless of the role. And then the third thing is the operational links. The communications team can never be too close to the operation. Communications campaigns will work well if they are supporting a good operation. And a good operation can only work well if it's got a good communications plan and strategy running alongside it. So during the Monarch operation, in the first few hours and days, it probably wasn't as seamless as we would like it to have been. But through the lessons learned process, we developed far closer coordination between the operations and the communications function, so that we were acting as one team. We needed to make sure that this was the case so that we didn't fall into some of the traps that can very easily appear when communications and operations are not as aligned as they should be or could be. So again, that lessons learned opportunity was invaluable to make sure that we brought that together in a seamless way so that the comms could support the operations had the right comms, and we can move on from there.
So what was our starting point with the Thomas Cook repatriation communications effort? Well, firstly, we needed to develop our assumptions, and planning is something that you hear about all the time in a crisis communication situation or in a crisis communications conference. And we have to admit that we were lucky in this situation in that we knew we had to plan for this because we knew it was a possible outcome. We didn't know when it would happen, we didn't know if it would happen, but we knew it was a possible outcome. And as the aviation regulator, along with our partners in government, particularly the Department for Transport and the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, we needed to make sure we were ready no matter what happened. So we had to start from we had to create a baseline. We had to create our baseline assumptions. What were the things that we thought could happen? What's our worst case scenario, but our plausible worst case scenario? A good example of some of these assumptions would be, if you think back to the beginning of this presentation, where I said that not everyone was ATOL protected, but government might ask us to bring everyone home, which is what they did. We knew that that was a fairly safe assumption that government was going to ask us to bring everyone home. So we built that into our assumptions and could really build our framework and our communication strategy around these assumptions. We also needed to create the right structures internally. And part of that is what Richard was just talking about with respect to the operational links between the communications team and those who are actually running the flying program. But also we needed to flatten our structure, which was something that senior management across the CAA was really keen that we did. Because in a crisis situation like this, you're faced with millions of decisions over the course of the 2-week flying program. It's simply not possible to funnel all those decisions upwards to senior management. So we needed to make sure that all our colleagues across the communications department and indeed across the whole CAA knew that they were empowered to make decisions and that they had the full support of the management in doing so. Thirdly, we needed to understand our stakeholders. We needed to think about how they were going to react to this news, what would be helpful to them, what wouldn't be helpful to them, and really thinking about where the risks were with our stakeholder map. Fourthly, we needed to consider resourcing needs. Now, this is, we are not a big communications team at the Civil Aviation Authority, and we knew that at the point that this happened, if it happened, we were going to be facing a barrage of social media requests, of social media DMs, of social media mentions, and of press office requests, and stakeholder requests, quite frankly. So we needed to make sure that our resourcing structure was really flexible and that we could we could flex it up, get those bums on seats in if we needed to, or turn it off if we were going through a quieter patch. And we heavily relied, thankfully, on some external partners who were really key to the success of that. And finally, we needed to prepare the team. Without sounding hyperbolic, Richard and I had lived through the Monarch experience, and we knew the toll that it could take, both on mental health and well-being, and also on your personal life, on your family life. We needed to prepare the team for that, but also be really clear about what the expectations of them were, and that we didn't want heroes. We didn't want people to try and do 27-hour days, granted that's impossible, and to try and have no breaks, because actually you doing an 8-hour shift, 10-hour shift, or a 12-hour shift, and having 12 hours off and coming back tomorrow feeling refreshed is actually much more valuable to us than having you zonked because you've decided to do a 20-hour day.
So when you get to the point where you have to start pressing buttons and going live, you have to be ready to go. You have to take control of the narrative. You have to try and answer people's questions before they even get a chance to ask you. And you have to try and keep the control of the narrative as far as you possibly can throughout the operation. And this is something that we did using a number of methods. But you have to be ready to go, and you have to make sure that the people are prepared and ready. So we had a number of spokespeople who were trained and ready to go. We had 10 people media trained on both occasions. We had 2 studios that were ISDN capable so that we could just blitz radio as much as we possibly could. And then we also had our own TV studio. Now, one of the things we learned was having that broadcast studio capability actually in our office made a massive difference, because we needed our senior spokespeople to be there on the ground dealing with the operation, but we also needed them to be able to sit in a studio and broadcast around the world within minutes of the operations going live. And that's exactly what happened. So one of the biggest things that we had was we had our very own satellite truck. And I can't tell you how exciting it is to have your very own satellite truck to broadcast around the world when you're dealing with something like this. Our office used to be in Kingsway, and there was a very easy place to position a satellite truck outside of our office where you had a direct link through to satellite. There were no big buildings around us, so that it was very easy to do. But when we started looking around our new office in Canary Wharf, The buildings and the way that things were structured made it very, very difficult to find the right spot to put a satellite truck. And if we tried to do that within 24 hours before the operation, we wouldn't have been able to make use of that particular capability because we wouldn't have been able to find the right place. It took us quite a while to find it, but eventually we found it. We had our own satellite truck for the Thomas Cook liquidation, and we were broadcasting internationally within minutes of making the announcement that the company had gone into liquidation. We had to have lots of things ready to go as soon as the announcement was made. And one of the other lessons that we learned from Monarch is that some of those things drifted out over the first few hours as we got to grips with the operation starting to happen. With the Thomas Cook situation, we had everything ready to go immediately, and we're going to talk about some of those assets in just a second. But the operation was a lot slicker and a lot quicker. We also employed an amplification process, which basically meant we had very simple messaging that we were trying to broadcast through as many channels as we could possibly find, relying on partners from the industry, from across government and elsewhere, to try and amplify our messages through all of their social media and other channels as far as we possibly could. And of course, that stakeholder engagement plan and that social media plan and strategy being in place and ready to go was absolutely vital, so that in the first few minutes, we hit as many people as we could. So the first few hours of an operation like this are absolutely critical. If those first few hours go well, then you are doing well. If they don't go well, your job becomes 10 to 100 times more difficult very, very quickly. But we had to think about the audiences all the way through. And of course, front of our minds, as this operation kicked off, were the Thomas Cook employees. And we were very conscious of the fact that some of those people would be waking up that morning and they'd be finding out that they had actually lost their jobs from one of our spokespeople being on the television talking about the liquidation of the company. And we were very conscious of that all the way through. So every time we developed assets and materials, we always had that front of mind to make sure that we were adopting the right empathetic tone, thinking about all of the different people who would be involved in this and who would be directly impacted by it. The customers at home, we were very conscious of the fact that there would be thousands of people driving to the airport as these announcements were made. There were probably a lot of people already at airports all over the country waiting to get on a flight the next morning. And of course, we knew that those flights would not be operating. So we had to get the message out there to those people. If you are still in the UK and you're about to travel to an airport, do not go to the airport because your flight will not be operating. If you're already at an airport, your flight will not be operating. So, either book a different one or go home. And we used a lot of local radio because we were aware that as people drive to the airport in the morning, they are most likely to be tuned into local radio stations. And so we were blitzing those local radio stations from two of our studios in the office and just trying to get that message out there as far and wide as possible. The UK airports, another big important audience for us. There was a real risk of things like civil disobedience and lots of people turning up at the airport. Having thousands of people turn up at your airport and you've got nowhere to send them is a very difficult thing to do. And as Will said, just imagine being that duty press officer at 3 o'clock in the morning getting this telephone call. That would be a very difficult thing to manage and to deal with. So we had to make sure that we reassured them they had the assets that we prepared for them and that they knew where we were so that we could keep in touch. The customers abroad, 150,000 people in the case of Thomas Cook, we had to get a message of reassurance out to them as quickly as possible. And our simple messaging going out through our multi-channel strategy was really important to get out in the first few minutes so that we had that reassurance message landing as people were waking up all around the world. And then, of course, the foreign airports. There were a number of foreign airports that we had to communicate with directly very quickly. Places like Dalaman in Turkey, where there were 40,000 Thomas Cook customers due to go through that airport. And so, of course, the local authorities were very concerned about this. So we had to talk to them and reassure them and explain to them what our operation was going to do to help them with the situation and to make sure that people knew that they were going to be coming home on our repatriation flights.
And we also had friends and families, worried grandparents at home. If you think about Thomas Cook's customer profile, there were often lots of young families, lots of young travelers who might be on their first foreign holiday away from their family, and indeed lots of elderly passengers. So we had lots of people at home who we knew would be worried about their grandparents abroad who might not have the right medication to get them through if they were delayed too long, or parents worried about their children on their first holiday abroad. So we needed to make sure that we were providing that reassurance to message to them very early on, but also activating them as word of mouth. You would have heard us say earlier that we were dealing with some really difficult passengers to reach. One of the key things that we knew we would have to tap into was word of mouth. We also had UK airlines, and we couldn't have done this, certainly the repatriation operation, without the UK airlines, who were a huge support. We had Virgin and British Airways supporting with flights from the USA and Cuba, and EasyJet and Ryanair supporting across Europe. We needed to keep them in the loop and make sure that they were aware of what was going on. And we also had those hoteliers, which we mentioned at the beginning of this presentation. Now, the reason that they presented such a difficult communications challenge for us was that they were worried that they weren't going to get paid. Thomas Cook, like lots of other tour operators, pay their hoteliers in arrears, so after the fact that the passenger has stayed. Lots of these organizations thought that they might not be paid, in some cases upwards of $1 million for passengers who already stayed with them over the summer. They, of course, react quite negatively to this, and in some instances, you see them trying to hold the guests hostage, hold onto their passports so they can't leave until they've paid again. Our job is to get to those hoteliers as early as possible and to make sure that they know that we will pay for the passengers who are currently staying with them, and that they should continue to enjoy their holiday in the hotel. But if we don't do that, if we didn't manage that in the first few hours, it could have presented a really, really challenging communications problem for us as the flying program unfolded. So how do we do all this? Well, the core of this was, of course, our multi-channel and consistent messaging approach. We wanted everything to be as consistent as possible. And part of that, and the heart of that, was that single source of truth, that dedicated website that we borrowed from what we did during Monarch, and we replicated it in Thomas Cook. It had all the information that passengers who were abroad could need, all their flight details. If their flight was delayed, we tried our best to make sure that the website reflected that. It had information for the travel industry, if they were getting concerned customers asking about what they needed to do, how they would get an ATOL refund, everything that you could possibly think of. And we pushed everyone towards this single source of truth. It was our first message, as Richard said, on traditional media, on broadcast, on social media. The first thing you heard any of our spokespeople say was go to the website and that will have your answers. And if not, we do have a call center stood up, but really the first port of call should always be that single source of truth, where we will keep it up to date, make sure it reflects the latest policy position. We also knew that social media would be an important tool in reaching those difficult passengers as well in those hard-to-reach places. So we had a significant program of targeted paid media and amplification to make sure that we were targeting passengers in resort. And finally, we developed what we called stakeholder toolkits, which was something that we did during Monarch, but actually expanded during Thomas Cook. And this comes back to that nightmare scenario about that duty press officer getting that call at 2 a.m. in the morning and finding out that the biggest airline at your airport has gone into liquidation. There'll be no flights taking place over the course of the day. What do you need? What do I need if I'm that duty press officer to deal with the hundreds or thousands of passengers showing up at 5 in the morning to get on a flight? Well, we created stakeholder toolkits. We really put ourselves in their shoes and thought through everything that they could possibly need, from draft Hanoi scripts to draft press releases, right through to posters that they could put up in the terminal. Part of that was helping them and doing our best and building those stakeholder relationships, but it was also allowing us to keep that messaging consistent and keep ownership of the narrative. So over the course of the 2-week flying program with Thomas Cook, we brought back 140,000 passengers. I hear some murmurs on the line that some of you are worried about those 10,000 other passengers. Well, they brought themselves home, as was their choice. We used 145 aircraft from across the world, over 750 different passenger journeys. We had 30,000 social media mentions and 15 million website views to that dedicated website, which we had to build to be super, super, super resilient. And we did, over that 2-week period, more than 200 broadcast interviews. But of course, it wasn't just about social or traditional media. We needed to make sure we were getting our wider engagement. We thought through our whole stakeholder landscape. We've spoken a lot about the industry. We had to make sure it was a two-way dialogue with them, and we had twice-daily conference calls set up with them so that they knew what was going on with the operation and that they knew what the communications risks associated with the operation were. But we also had to think about our friends in Westminster, politicians, particularly those who are significantly impacted by this news. Our Tier 1 politicians, they might have significant job losses in their constituency. They might have one of the major airports that Thomas Cook was flying from in their constituency. And like the media, we kept them updated with daily briefings on exactly how the operation was going. So they had the statistics and the messages at their fingertips if they were going on local media or local radio. We also kept our aviation interested MPs, like our Transport Select Committee members, updated as well. And we also had to think about the broader parliamentary estate. This happened while Parliament was sitting, unlike Monarch, and we had an urgent question in one of the first few days. I can't remember which day it was, but we wanted to make sure that parliamentarians right across the House of Commons knew exactly what was going on, and so we kept them updated with parliamentary briefings that went to all MPs and responded to constituency concerns as they came up throughout the programme.
And of course, for something of this significance and this scale, you're going to have a cross-government interest and cross-government participation. And all of this came down to very close working relationships and partnerships between the CAA and people across government. Obviously, with the Department for Transport, the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, and of course the Cabinet Office and the role that the Cabinet Office plays in the coordination across government, and then into things like COBRA and other things. And that partnership was incredibly powerful and incredibly successful. And I know that there are colleagues on the line from DFT and from FCO as well. And I know that Will and I would really pay tribute to everybody in those organisations and across government who really worked so closely and so diligently with us throughout this. Having embeds from FCO and DFT, working with us, sitting alongside us in our team in the office was made a massive, massive difference. The thing to remember is that there is also an insatiable appetite from government for information when you're in the middle of an operation like this, and you have to keep that level of information. You have to keep providing that level of information to make sure that people understand exactly how things are going and how you are progressing and what you need from that wider government. We were dealing, I think, with 10, 11 different government departments across the board as we went through this operation. And you have to keep everything under review. And this is a really important part of running any kind of crisis or issue situation. You have to keep everything under review because you can't plan for every single scenario. If you did that, you'd spend all your time doing it, and you probably still wouldn't find exactly the right scenario anyway. So you have to be ready to adapt the strategy as best you can. There are three quick examples here. Operational challenges. When you're running an airline, as many of our colleagues in the aviation world will tell you, things happen all the time, and you have to deal with those operational challenges. We have hundreds of people on a daily basis who we had to put up in hotels because the aircraft that we'd sent to collect them and bring them back to the UK had gone tech, meaning that it couldn't operate at that point, so we had to send another one. We had situations where we wanted to send a particular aircraft into a particular airport, but the aircraft type was the wrong type of aircraft to send to that airport. You cannot land an A380 on a Greek island because the runway simply isn't big enough. So there were all these sort of operational challenges that we had to manage as part of this enormous jigsaw puzzle of activity that we had to get together. The media narrative and that wider narrative, we needed to make sure that we were feeding the beast all the way through this operation. We needed to make sure that we were giving people the information that they needed. And our task was to try and answer as many questions as we possibly could before people even asked us the questions. So we issued a daily press release, usually at the same time every day, probably between sort of 5 and 6 o'clock in the morning, that talked about the numbers from the day before and the expected numbers from the day ahead, always giving a running commentary about how far we'd made it through the operation, how many people had come back, how many flights had operated, and any other information that we could think of that people would find of interest. And we issued this to, obviously, the media, to political audiences, and to a wider industry and stakeholder group, just to make sure that people were kept up to date with how we were going, where we were getting to, and if there was anything that we particularly needed. And then, of course, the stakeholder approach was really, really important. Will mentioned the calls that we organised with our stakeholders, especially across the industry, but there were so many other stakeholder interactions that we needed to make sure were happening. We needed that two-way communications in place. We needed people in the industry, in politics, in media, wherever it might be. We needed people to know where we were and what we were doing. We needed as much feedback as possible because we wanted to know whether any issues were developing at any point in any of the locations that we were managing. And that intelligence is incredibly helpful because it allows you to reflect on all sorts of other things and make sure that you have everything in place. So understanding who your contacts need to be, understanding how you will contact them, understanding what connections can be in place, and making sure that they know where you are, how to reach you, and keeping all of that under review all the way through is incredibly important in a major operation like this. And then, as you would expect me to say, I will finish with learning the lessons from the experience of Thomas Cook. There are 4 things that we've identified. There are a number of others, but for the benefit of the presentation today, 4 things that we'll focus on. Number 1, thinking ahead. Give yourself the time that you need to think ahead. One of the things that we realized is that we focused so much on preparing for the flying program and that 2-week operation that at the end of it, when there was still an awful lot to do, we hadn't given ourselves enough time to think about all of those other things in the tail of the operation, things we're still working on today. So whilst the material development, the assets, and all of those things were ready and ready to go for the actual flying program, the operation, we weren't ready to go with everything that followed. And some things will trip you up in the aftermath of something like this because you haven't given yourself enough time to think about it. So preparing up front is, of course, really, really important. Social media. Our social media channels became customer service channels because of the number of people who wanted to contact us for information. We didn't want to use our CAA website as the main website for this operation, so we created a new one. We didn't do the same thing with social media, and we think that we should have done. Our CAA Twitter handle, for example, has never been used for customer service interactions in the past. Over the last few months, it's been used for thousands, if not millions, of of customer interactions. And it's now something that has set an expectation for our wider operations, which we will not meet in the future. So if we were ever to have to do something on this scale in the future, we would probably develop a separate Twitter handle and think about our social media strategy in a very different way and approach it very differently to how we did this time. Resilience is also another really important thing, and you have to think about resilience right from the beginning. You have to have the right kind of support for your team before, during, and after. You have to make sure that you've got the right number of people available to you to do all of the jobs that need to be done and to perform all of the things that you need to happen during an operation like this. So we went to VMA, actually, a recruitment agency. We talked to them, and we told them about our specific needs, and we basically got a brand new team of people who came in to join our team, and who did a fantastic job, and who integrated with us overnight, which was absolutely incredible. And it gave us those bums on the seats that we needed in the press office and across the wider communications landscape. And some of those people are still working with us today on the tail of this operation. But thinking about the resilience, everybody has a different level of resilience and a different view of resilience. Some people can go for a lot longer than others, and some people need more rest and recuperation. And as a manager, you need to be able to understand that and act on that as quickly as possible. And the last thing is to make sure that you have your seat at the table. Anybody in communications who is involved in something like this needs to be very focused on having a seat at the table. You need to be involved in the operation on policy discussions and decisions all the way through, all the way from the beginning, all the way to the very end. Now, I think in some of the jobs I've done in the last few years that comms seat at that table is certainly more readily available than it was in the past. However, it's not always, you can't always conclude that it's going to be there. And as Shirley Chisholm once said, who was the very first black congresswoman in America, she said, if they don't give you a seat at the table, bring your own folding chair. And that would be the best bit of advice that I would give anybody in communications who was approaching something like this. You have to be at that table. If you're not at that table naturally, go sit around it anyway and get on with it. And I think that will conclude our presentation today. Thank you very much again for joining us. And I know that Will and I will be more than happy to answer a few questions.
Thank you both so much. That was great. And I know we can all take some direction from your strategy, especially putting other people, getting into other people's shoes and thinking about collateral that stakeholders might need when issues arise. And thank you to the audience for plugging in your questions. As expected, this presentation has had an excellent response. So let's dive into some questions now. I'll start with this one. Somebody has written, in the era of fake news, were there any inaccuracies you had to challenge?
Oh, that's a really good question. One of the things that we needed to push back on a lot, particularly in traditional media, and something that our chair got frightfully irritated by, was the word stranded. This came up a lot. It was 150,000 passengers stranded abroad. Well, we would always say no, they would be stranded if we weren't going to collect them. That's that's not the definition of stranded. We are going to get them. They're enjoying the rest of their holiday as you would expect. So stranded is what they are not. And we took quite an aggressive approach, picking up on that and pushing back on that when we saw it, and saw quite a few headlines changed, certainly online, to reflect that, because that was something that we didn't think represented what was going on at all, and stoked fear, unnecessary fear and panic amongst the passengers that we were trying to help.
Brilliant. So clearly you guys drove this, but how did interactions with other agencies work?
Well, another great question, and you're absolutely right. We were working with so many different people. I mentioned the 10 or so government departments that we were working with. Will talked about the industry and the response from the industry, the number of airlines, but also it wasn't just airlines. It was all of those different organisations and companies that work on the ground around airports and around aviation in general. And I honestly don't know how many partners we had in all of this, but I mean, probably hundreds. I don't know. But certainly, when you think about an operation all around the world, the number of people and the number of organisations you need to involve is significant. It is huge. It's a job in itself just to work out where all these people are and how we actually coordinate with them. But again, as I said earlier on, we had the epicenter of the entire operation was our office here in Canary Wharf. An entire floor of our office building was taken up with this operation, with things like flight operations, communications, escalations, and all sorts of other things, teams all around the office. And we couldn't have done the job that we did without the support of all of these different agencies, government departments, industry partners, and everybody else. And in fairness, also, politicians, the media, a lot of people were incredibly supportive for what we were doing. So it was a huge coordination task. But again, having people like DFT, FCO, Cabinet Office and others in the office with us and working alongside us was enormously beneficial.
Great, thank you. We've got another one here. How do you return to the team to normal after an operation like this?
You know what? When I know the answer to that question, I'll have to come back to you on it.
I don't know if we're yet back to normal.
Well, I agree. I don't think we are. And Will mentioned earlier on that we'd gone through the Monarch experience, and so we were a little bit better equipped, I think, to understand what was coming when we got to this point. But a lot of people in our team weren't. They hadn't lived through the Monarch experience. And so you go through it and you come out to the other end, and it's really, really difficult to return to BAU after being in the middle of something of this significance. You cannot wake up in the morning and turn the TV on without the lead story being something that you're actually working on. You can't have a conversation with anybody in or out of the office without it being dominated by this particular thing. So when you've gone through 2, 3, 4 weeks of that, it's incredibly difficult to get back. And I think that productivity probably dips a bit at that point. A, because everyone's really tired. B, because you've been running on adrenaline for so long. C, because you're not entirely sure what you're supposed to be doing at that point. So Will and I worked very closely with our team, and we were first of all thinking about the rest and recuperation people needed. We gave people extra holiday days just to go and do whatever you want to do, but just go away and try and recharge your batteries and decompress and do all of those things. So it's very difficult to get back to normal, but it's also very important to try and get back to normal as quickly as you possibly can.
Sure, yeah. This leads on quite nicely to the next question. How do you find the capacity to keep everything else ticking over, or is it a case of all hands on deck?
Well, I mean, that's another really good question. I mean, from an operational perspective, it's not possible as a safety regulator for us to put everyone on an operation like this. We do have a large consumer and markets team who were fully involved with this. They're the ones who oversee the ATOL scheme. But of course, we needed to keep the day-to-day functioning of safety regulation and safety oversight going, so that we did have lots of people ring-fenced to do BAU. And similarly, although I suspect from a communications perspective, the BAU was rolled back quite a lot, we did need to do general correspondence, respond to FOIs, and do the things that you would expect from any public agency. So we too had some resource ring-fence to continue the BAU, the day-to-day functioning of the department going. But I must stress, in something like this, it is all-consuming, and that resource was kept to the minimum that it could possibly be. Great.
Got one here. Sadly, we can't all have in-house broadcast studio or satellite truck. So what are the other options?
Well, in fairness, we don't have a broadcast studio or a satellite truck all the time. It's just when you're dealing with an operation like this, you have to bring it in. So I think any organisation that is faced with something of a significant magnitude, and you would have to make your own decisions about, when you cross that threshold. But anybody who's facing something like this, my advice would be really think about whether you need your own broadcast studio, really think about how you would make that happen. Because if you have your chair, your chief exec, your directors and your operations people doing the job they need to do, but you also need them to be talking to the media, you need to try and ring fence a senior spokesperson, which is what we did with our chair and one of our other directors, so that they can deal with all of that media that you need to do, because you need to get the message out there to all of your audiences. And there are only two ways to do it. Number one is you bring it in. Well, sorry, there are three ways to do it. Number one is you've got it anyway. Number two is you bring it in, which is what we did. And then, of course, after, I think probably 2 or 3 days, I think it was 3 or 4 days, we actually stood it down. And then after that, of course, which is option number 3, is every time there's an opportunity you want to make the most of, you have to, get on the tube and go to the studio and do it. And actually, we had all 3 of those things during the Thomas Cook 2-week flying program. We had the studio, but we certainly weren't going to spend money on having that for 2 weeks when some days we weren't doing any interviews at all. So we only kept that for the first, I think it was 3 or 4 days. We then let that go. We then were sending people out to the studios to do the interviews that we thought were really important to do. And then after that, we actually pulled back from the media a little bit, and we didn't really do very much in a few days, just to focus on the operation and to get everything done. And towards the end of the operation, we then started to do other things, such as, which was a really important thing, Will and a couple of colleagues took one of the flights down to Palma, one of the repatriation flights, with some journalists to actually show them inside of the operation, because at that point we could do that.
Great. So I guess it's about a balance of resources and, knowing when to use them and budgets. Yeah, of course. Moving on to the next question. How do you monitor social media for people with gripes? This is something we can all learn, really.
Yeah, it's a really good question, and we have been dealing with a lot of that. During the flying program, it wasn't really gripes. There were lots of people who wanted to know how they were going to get home and when they were going to get home, and there was a lot of that customer service on Twitter and other channels as well. During the claims process, the claims process is an incredibly complex thing to do, and we are, paying millions and millions of pounds out all the time to people who have valid claims. And of course, where money is concerned, people quite rightly and quite understandably want to get that money back as quickly as they possibly can. And in some cases, it's very difficult for us to do that because of the risk of fraud, because of the checks we have to do, because the quality of the data that we get sometimes isn't very good, and actually in some cases because somebody just very accidentally has given us the wrong bank account number. So actually we think we paid it out, but actually it hasn't arrived in the right place. So we've got all sorts of things like that going on. And understandably, when you're talking about thousands of pounds, people get very upset about that. So we've had to deal with a lot of that more recently. But actually, it's coming towards the end now, and that's it's a lot better, the situation. But you do have to keep an eye on it, and you have to think about your team who's dealing with some of that, because some of it can be, really quite upsetting.
I completely agree. There's 2 things I think I would add to that. One is you have to remember that the person at the end is, well, usually human. So long as you haven't been infected with Russian bots or anything. And so the worst thing you can do is to continue to give them a robotic set answer. You have to, if people are getting really worked up, you have to respond to the question and not do what I think a lot of organizations do in a crisis, which is just refer back to the piece of paper with approved messages saying, I'm sorry, or whatever it says. So that's the first thing. The second thing I would encourage people to do is think about what I'm going to call it your vexatious threshold is. Because at some point, these do become vexatious, and you need to be able to draw a line and say, I'm sorry, I'm not going to continue this discussion because, however you want to phrase it, it's not conducive to anyone's mental health. So you do need to think about at what point does it go from someone just being incredibly frustrated to actually being vexatious, and how you handle that, and what you're going to say to that person to bring that conversation to a close.
Yeah, and would you say that your tactics is to be quite personal in your messaging on social media?
You go on. It certainly has been, and as Will says, you have to, when you're dealing with thousands and thousands, it's very difficult to give everybody a unique response. However, certainly for the first few weeks, we were dealing with thousands, and we were responding to people. I forget the numbers now, but we were responding to most of them certainly within an hour. I think all of them within an hour, and some of them within 5 minutes. You have to keep on the ball. People expect an immediate response. We did everything we possibly could to do that, and we tried to personalise it as best we could. But of course, when you're dealing with things like finances, with money, with all of that, you have to be very, very careful about how far you go down that road. And so sometimes you have to direct people into other channels. But yeah, people expect an answer. They expect a personal service. Sometimes you can do it, sometimes you can't, and you have to be very transparent about that.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. We've got another question here. You mentioned flattening the decision-making process. How did that work in practice, and who was responsible for signing off the content?
So I think in a situation like this, you have to have a flat structure. You really have to. And we had all sorts of communications going in and out all of the time. And some of the time, Will and I even, at some point, actually had to go and sleep somewhere, just for a few hours,
Wow.
And every now and again, it was a bit of a blessing, a bit of a bonus. And so you have to make sure you've got people who are in the office who can make things happen very, very quickly. So we came up with a bit of a rota structure whereby there'd always be a senior person in the office who can make things happen. There'd always be a duty manager in there who could make the relevant phone calls if something were to happen. And we always knew that either Will or I or one of our other senior colleagues was in the office as much as possible. So there was always one of us there. And if not, the duty manager would know that one of us was in a hotel room 5 minutes away if anything ever happened. Now, I don't think I ever got any of those calls. Do you know? So, I mean, actually, it worked out really, really well for us. But we did flatten the structure. We just got people activated, and everybody knew what their role was. Everybody knew what they had to get on and do. Everybody knew who they needed to speak to. And when things came in, we had a very sort of transparent approach to it. We were all sitting in the same place, and we were talking about things as they came in and how we were going to deal with them. So I was really pleased. It was that flat, and things did happen. In terms of sign-off, you have to be very careful about that, because the sign-off isn't necessarily for us in the communications team to deal with. You have to make sure you've got your subject matter expert to have signed off the content. So if there's a particular, a question about how the ATOS scheme works, for example, we might not know the answer, but we know who does know the answer. And keeping all of that data up to date and making sure that those people had signed off on that subject matter expert level was probably the most important thing. But those guys were on the same floor of us, a 10-second walk away, and we kept in contact with them through that operational link all the time. So that actually was relatively straightforward as well. But the flatter, the better in this kind of situation.
Great. I think we might have time for a couple more quick ones. So which external partners helped in flexing resource?
Really easy. I mean, in terms of flexing resource, VMA was a recruitment agency we used who did an extraordinary amount of help. In fact, we still have some of their colleagues with us today. And
also the government.
And the government, yeah.
From across government who were working in our teams and who were embeds, within our team and working alongside us. And again, one of the great things about that, we talked about the VMA people coming in and just integrating with us immediately. And the fantastic thing about our FCO and DFT embeds especially was that they just became an essential part of our team immediately. And again, talking about flat structure, just flattening all of those things down and making sure we had that sort of seamless approach across all of those different organisations was incredibly helpful. But VMA, as Will said, I can't remember now, I can't remember the numbers by now, but I think we had 20, 25 people who at one point or another were working with us on this. So communications experts in one way or another. Amazing help and support.
Brilliant, thank you. And last one, how do you know that you did it well?
Very good question. Well, look, we know that we did it well because of all those people who actually ended up back in the UK. On the operational side of things, the numbers speak for themselves. The operation was a success because, as Will said, 150,000 people we were preparing for, 140,000 people used our repatriation flights, only 10,000 people chose to do something different. Now, of course, in the normal course of events, probably a lot of those people wouldn't have come back on the plane or the aircraft that they had already booked on. So, actually that speaks volumes. That speaks volumes, again, alongside the communication strategy, because, as we said earlier on, the operational side and the communication side have to dovetail, they have to work together. And a great operation is never a great operation if the communications isn't right, and the communications can never be great if the operation isn't good. So, we know that was very successful. So I think I personally would say the numbers speak for themselves, but the response from industry, from around the world, from stakeholders, and actually the pride that's felt within the organisation itself also tells its own story. But again, very difficult, very sad, and a very sort of emotional time for everybody involved, especially those people who were directly impacted, and that's something that we never lose sight of.
Thank you. Perfect. So that's all we have time for today. I'd like to thank you again, Richard and Will, for coming in. It's been a real pleasure to have you back. We'll be making the webinar available soon, so please keep an eye on your emails for those slides. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Charlie.